Starting in 1959, a few months after the Avro era was cancelled, Canadair began building Canada's next hot rod at their plant in Montreal. It was designed as a sleek high-altitude and high-speed interceptor, but was adapted for low-level ground strike missions with conventional and nuclear weapons. It was the Canadair CF-104 Starfighter, Canada's missile with a man in it. In the 1950s, Canada was committed to the air defense of Europe against perceived Soviet aggression. It was at this time that Canada fielded the fourth largest air force in the world. The RCAF deployed 12 squadrons of day fighters across 4 bases in Europe. 2 in France at Marville and Grostenquin, and 2 in West Germany at Zweibrücken and Baden-Scholingen. Initially, these squadrons consisted of CL-13 Sabres, but later included CF-100 Canucks to provide an all-weather capability. The RCAF's No. 1 Canadian Air Division squadrons were considered to be among the best formations that NATO could field in Europe at the time. In the late 1950s, Canada revised its role in the defense of Europe in response to a changing threat. Initially, Canada was concerned with protecting Europe from waves of nuclear-armed Soviet bombers. With the launch of Sputnik, the threat had shifted to that posed by similarly armed ballistic missiles. Since the ballistic missile could not be intercepted, militaries all over the world pivoted their focus and their budgets away from interceptor aircraft. The unfortunate result of which for Canadian prestige was the cancellation of the Avro Aero Interceptor and the Orenda Iroquois engine. NATO requested that Canadian squadrons switch from an all-weather fighter intercept role to a deterrent nuclear strike and reconnaissance role. RCAF planners welcomed the shift, as their now seemingly obsolete Sabre fighters were due to be retired anyway. A competition was arranged to fill this new role. The English Blackburn Buccaneer, the French Dassault Mirage 3, the Italian Fiat G91, the American Grumman Super Tiger, Lockheed F-104G Starfighter, Northrop N-156, and the Republic F-105 Thunder Chief, equipped with an Orenda Iroquois engine, were all considered. The Thunder Chief Iroquois combination was the initial favorite, as it would revive Orenda's premier project, but the rapidly spiraling costs and a requirement for local construction led to the selection of the Lockheed offering. Lockheed had pushed hard for their design, hoping to find new customers for it after the USAF drastically cut their order for the planes. Although designed in the early 1950s as a high-speed and high-altitude interceptor, they were convinced that it could also operate as a multi-mission low-level attack aircraft. It was marketed to Germany and other NATO nations as a replacement for older obsolete types. They created the F-104G, which significantly improved on the original design. It incorporated a strengthened airframe, larger vertical fin, a highly accurate inertial navigation system, an uprated engine, improved flight controls, and an improved fire control radar with ground mapping capability. RCAF officials felt that the Swift Interceptor's performance would be well adapted to the low-level strike and reconnaissance role. Unlike the USAF and other air forces such as Japan and Italy, the RCAF had no intention of using the 104 as an interceptor. Instead, it would be used purely in the air-to-ground role as a bomber. In August of 1959, a deal with Lockheed was signed, and Canadair was chosen to produce and modify the design according to RCAF specifications at their plant in Montreal, Quebec. Canadair's initial designation for the Starfighter was the CL-90, and the RCAF's was the CF-111. But these would later both change to fall in line with the American designations, and it would become the CF-104. The F-104G variant would be used as the basis for Canadair's production run. Modifications would be made to bring it up to the requirements of the RCAF and optimize it for the nuclear strike and reconnaissance role. Changes included a dedicated air-to-ground R-24A NASAR radar set, the replacement of the 20mm M61A1 cannon with a range-extending fuel tank, provisions for a ventrally mounted reconnaissance pod equipped with 4 Vinton Vicon 70mm cameras, longer stroke springs for the undercarriage, and larger tires. The USAF provided the pattern aircraft for Canadair, serialized as 104-700. Construction on the Canadian copy started in 1959 at Canadair's plant in Cartierville, Quebec. The first completed CF-104 was shipped to Palmdale, California, and took its first flight there on the 26th of May, 1961. The third and fourth built Starfighters, numbered 12703 and 12704, took their first flights together from Montreal on August 14, 1961. Canadair would go on to build 200 CF-104s, and a further 140 F-104G rear airframe and wing sections for Germany on behalf of Lockheed. Orenda Engines was contracted to build the General Electric J79 engines that would power them. Construction would continue until the last Starfighter, 104-900, was rolled out on September 4, 1963. Final deliveries of the aircraft were completed by January of 1964. To complete the procurement, a further 38 twin-seat TF-104G versions, redesignated the CF-104D, and equipped with Canadian-built J79 OEL-7 engines, were produced by Lockheed and would be used to train pilots on the new type. The CF-104 was long and slender, with short, sharp wings and a T-tail. It was 16.7 meters long, 4.08 meters tall, and had a wingspan of only 6.63 meters. The thin wings were 11 centimeters thick at the root and 5 centimeters thick at the tip. The sharp wings posed a hazard to ground crews, and protective covers were installed during maintenance. The 104 could fly at 1,844 km per hour, or Mach 1.5, at altitudes up to 15,240 meters. It had a combat range of 675 kilometers with 2 wingtip tanks, or could fly 2,630 kilometers in a ferrying configuration. It was powered by a mighty Orenda J79 OEL-7 afterburning turbojet engine, producing 44 kilonewtons of thrust at sea level. It increased to 66.7 kilonewtons with the afterburners lit. The landing gear cannot fit in the thin wings, and so they have to be retracted into the slender fuselage. The complex folding mechanism delayed the early American production aircraft, but the problems were fixed by the time Canadair began production. Landing speeds in the 104 were fairly high at around 300 kilometers per hour. Large hydraulic brakes and a drag chute are used to slow the plane down. An arrestor hook was also present for emergency situations where the aircraft's drag chute or hydraulics have failed. Thick cables are strung across the runway and are caught by the hook. The cockpit was austere from a modern perspective. All the controls and dials were analog and required the pilot to navigate and aviate with the so-called stick and rudder approach. The 104 would be the last fighter of this type, as its replacement, the CF-18, would propel pilots into the digital age. Pilots sat on a Lockheed C2 ejection seat. Boot spurs on the heels attached to the seat through thin cables. In the event of an ejection, these spurs would pull the legs tight to the seat, while a net would simultaneously close around the pilot to prevent flailing injuries during high-speed ejections. The CF-104 initially had 3 pylons for external stores, one on each wingtip and a ventral centerline pylon. The wingtip pylons typically held additional fuel tanks, while the centerline pylon was reserved for the main armament. The Canadian Starfighters initially carried no defensive weapons, due to its anticipated low-level attack profile. It was thought that speed, low altitude, and the small size of the 104 would keep it safe from enemy anti-aircraft systems and interceptors. The offensive weapon configuration evolved through time. Initially, the Starfighters had 2 distinct configurations. It could be equipped with 4 Vinton Vicon 70mm cameras, positioned in a ventrally mounted pod for the reconnaissance role, Alternatively, in the nuclear defense role, the 104 could be armed with a U.S.-supplied nuclear weapon. A single B-28, B-43, or B-57 free-fall thermonuclear bomb could be carried on a centerline pylon. These weapons proved very controversial within Canada and led to friction between it and fellow NATO countries. The nuclear strike role was a unique role within the RCAF. The quasi-one-way missions were flown by single 104s. The projected targets were deep inside the Soviet Union, and so the 104s would only have enough fuel to carry out its mission, but not return to base. It was intended that the 104s make it to a bailout location where they could safely parachute to the ground and remain in hiding for the remainder of the war, which was expected to last only a few days. Thankfully, this near-suicidal mission was never carried out. The Canadian 104s started their long career with the RCAF in 1961, after the first aircraft were delivered to the No. 6 Strike Reconnaissance Operational Training Unit in Cold Lake, Alberta. Canadair was hoping to cash in on the RCAF's investment in the 104 by creating a specialized version of their Tudor trainer equipped with NASAR systems. Unfortunately, the plan fell through and the NASAR radar training was carried out using modified Dakota transports, casually known as Pinocchios, sporting a Starfighter-style nose cone and a radar set. All new pilots trained for the low-level nuclear strike role. Any pilots destined for reconnaissance roles would retrain and qualify at their operational bases. Later, all pilots would be trained in low-level conventional strike role. The No. 6 OTU was redesignated as the 417 Squadron in 1970 when the RCAF was reformed as the Canadian Forces. The last class to graduate was in November 1982, and the squadron was disbanded in 1983 following the retirements of the 104s. The Starfighters destined for Europe would form the RCAF's nuclear strike role in Europe. 139 were partially disassembled and flown across the ocean in C-130 Hercules transport aircraft. The first squadron to form was the 427 of 3rd Wing stationed in Zweibrücken, Germany, in December of 1962. In April of the following year, the 434 would join the 422nd. 1962 also saw 25 CF-104s built and sold to Denmark as part of the U.S. Mutual Aid Program. These starfighters would form 2 squadrons based in Aalborg. By July of 1963, the 422 and 444 squadrons of 4-Wing were formed at Baden-Scholingen, Germany. The 421 and 430 squadrons were originally deployed to 2-Wing at Gostenquin, France, in late 1963. Shortly after arriving, the French government decided to pursue their own nuclear weapons program, and they didn't want foreign powers to store their weapons on French soil. As such, the 2-Wing was disbanded, and the 421 and 430 nuclear strike squadrons stationed there were moved to bases in Germany. The 421 was moved to 4-Wing in Baden-Scholingen, and the 430 was moved to 3-Wing in Zweibrücken in February of 1964. In March 1964, the 439 and 441 photo reconnaissance squadrons were formed at 1-Wing in Marville, France. They remained there until 1967 when they were moved to Lahr, Germany. The 434 and 444 squadrons based in Germany were disbanded in 1968. This reduced the CF-104 strength to 4 nuclear strike and 2 tactical reconnaissance squadrons operating in Europe. In May 1969, the 3-Wing based in Zweibrücken was closed, and the 427 was moved to Baden-Scholingen, and the 430 was moved to Lahr, joining the 439 and 441. Thanks to the 104's 675-kilometer combat range, these squadrons could cover all of Germany, Austria, northern Italy, and Czechoslovakia. The Canadian government made the controversial decision to rebrand the RCAF as the Canadian Armed Forces, or CAF, in 1968 in an effort to save money. They also reduced the strength of the 1st Air Division from 6 squadrons to 3, and renamed it the No. 1 Canadian Air Group. The 422, 427, and 430 squadrons were disbanded, and the base at Lahr was closed in 1970. The 439 and 441 squadrons were moved to forewing at CFB Baden-Scholingen, joining the 421. Starting in 1970, the 421 and 441 converted to the conventional strike role, while the 439 remained in the reconnaissance role until 1962, when it too converted to the strike role. The Canadian government's decision to change the role of the 104s from nuclear strike to tactical ground support necessitated further modifications to their airframes. For the conventional attack role, the 104 was re-equipped with the M61A1 cannon, and new pylons were installed on the wings for the carriage of conventional munitions. Types of weapons carried by the modified CF-104s include Mark 82 Snake-Eye iron bombs, napalm canisters, Mark 20 Rockeye cluster bombs, BL-755 cluster bombs, and Canadian-designed CVR-7 rocket pods. The radar was also adapted from a purely air-to-ground mode to a more multi-mission capability that included air-to-air modes. While somewhat capable of aerial combat, the Canadian 104s never carried any air-to-air ordnance other than its Vulcan cannon. By 1972, all CF-104s had been modified to the new standard. This conventional attack configuration would remain until the Starfighter was withdrawn from service starting in 1982. In contrast to the solo nuclear strike mission, the conventional attack had to involve multiple aircraft. Due to the fact they could only carry 4 bombs, as many as 12 starfighters would be involved in a single attack to ensure destruction of the target. Coordinating these attacks was immensely challenging and added a further layer of complexity on top of an already heavy pilot workload. Aircraft separated their attacks by mere seconds, and precise timing was required to both surprise the enemy and to ensure a level of safety for the 104 crews, who also had to concern themselves with preventing mid-air collisions. Canada sold 22 surplus CF-104s to Norway, and another 15 CF-104s and 7 CF-104Ds to Denmark between 1972 and 1974, following their conversion to the F-104G standard. These sales reflected a sharp reduction in the number of squadrons fielded by the Canadian Armed Forces in Europe. Starting in 1981, Canada began to phase out the Starfighter. 46 CF-104s and 6 CF-104Ds were transferred to the Turkish Air Force, where they were joined by 3 CF-104s previously transferred there by Norway. 20 were overhauled in Germany before delivery, and the rest were broken down as spares. These starfighters would remain in Turkish service until they were all finally retired in 1996 and replaced with the F-16. By 1987, all starfighters in the Canadian inventory were retired and replaced by the CF-18 Hornet. There were many unofficial names for the CF-104 Starfighter, including the Silver Sliver, Zipper, Aluminum Death Tube, the Londark, and the Flying Phallus, but pilots and ground crew never called it the Widowmaker. That was a term the media used to sensationalize the 104's track record. While it's true that 43% of Canadian 104s crashed, understanding what that number represents is difficult to unpack. The nature of their mission, pilot workload, weather, and wildlife all played a role. Pilots were expected to fly at high speeds at near treetop levels to attack their targets. The 104 had a terrible glide ratio due to its small, heavily loaded wings, and that combined with its low-level mission led to many accidents. Pilots had very little time to correct mistakes or eject before crashing into the ground. Many pilots chose to eject rather than to try to recover. Pilot workload in the 104 was high. For instance, in order to drop a set of cluster bombs, 11 switches needed to be set, all while navigating with a stopwatch and map at treetop levels and at high speeds. Any mistakes could result in collision with the terrain. Despite this, 104 pilots flew thousands of mock missions to test and hone their skills. bird strikes were a huge problem and resulted in the loss of dozens of airframes and pilots. The 500-foot normal operating altitude meant that they would be flying at the same altitude range as birds. Ingesting them into the engine intake was an all too common problem and resulted in major or fatal damage to the engine. Interestingly, only 2 accidents were directly attributed to mechanical failures. The rest were combinations of bird strikes, weather conditions like heavy fog, and pilot error. From a flight hour perspective, Canada had one of the lowest accident rates among all the countries that flew the Starfighter in Europe. 115 airframes, or 43% of Canadian 104s, crashed, killing 37 pilots. This is in contrast to the German loss rate of 292 airframes, or 32% of their inventory, killing 115 pilots. The major difference between the two was the fact that Canadian 104s flew an average of 6,000 hours before retiring the airframes, while the Germans flew an average of only 2,000 hours of flight time before retiring their airframes. This is to say that Canadian pilots flew 3 times more missions than their German counterparts per aircraft. While the loss rate is still undeniably very high, it does put into perspective the skill of the Canadian pilots in executing such a dangerous mission. While not designed in Canada, the Canadian-built CF-104 Starfighter was the fastest aircraft to serve with the RCAF and was well loved by its pilots. Considered the hottest ship in the fleet, 104 pilots had a well-deserved swagger in their spur-studded steps.